Okay, what's positive behavioral support? You've probably seen this already. Assess the function of behaviors, which we're going to talk about. You have short-term prevention, and then I'm going to really spend a lot of time talking about replacing behaviors. But now, I was telling my class, I said I got in trouble giving a talk recently, and they said, well, why do you say things that get people upset? I said, well, I say things that get people upset because then they listen. If I say things that people already agree with, then they don't listen. They just say, oh yeah, I know that. So now I'm going to get some of you upset. So you'll listen. And then you won't ever invite me back to this nice winter, and I'll have to stay back in Albany where it's probably snowing again and muddy. Short-term prevention, what do I mean? Short-term prevention is when you have a child who might be getting upset because the work is too hard. It might be too difficult. Short-term prevention strategy could be to make the work easier. Okay? We can give you easier work, you won't get upset now. That's a short-term prevention strategy. Or we work with kids with autism who have trouble when things are not predictable. So one way to help a child who gets upset when things are not predictable is make them predictable. We're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. That's a short-term prevention strategy. This is teaching 101. If you say short-term in as many different ways and times as you possibly can, short-term, then people will pick up that short-term is really the issue here. It's not long-term, it's short-term. But what's happening? What's happening in the field as I go around and visit programs is it's often stopping here. Okay? We make the work easier, the behavior problems go away, we're done. We used to have arguments in the old days about things like restraints. Should you restrain a child who's hitting themselves? And people talked about kind of the humane aspects. It's inhumane to restrain somebody, and it is. Sometimes there are reasons why some people might do it, but you try to avoid it at all costs. What happens in those old days was I didn't like restraints because it really doesn't treat people well. But the real problem with restraints is the crisis goes away. Okay, so if I'm doing this, and I tie your hands down and you're not doing that anymore, no one is upset anymore. The crisis is gone, and you go to the next crisis. You go to the next kid who has a more severe problem. The meeting that you're going to have on Tuesday to discuss head hitting, well, we can put that off till next week because it's not a crisis anymore. The funding that you needed to help this kid, well, maybe we won't do that now because we have this other problem. These short-term prevention strategies end crises. When the crisis ends, people get complacent and they move on. I don't know how many times I've been in this situation just this year. It's just this time of year where people have said, well, in the beginning we had this problem, so we changed the room around, and then this problem went away, and then we were going to have a meeting in October, but that got changed, and then we were going to have a meeting in November. Well, but now it's April, and the end of the year is almost there, so we haven't done anything all year long. We haven't solved the problem. We've just prevented the problem. What I'll suggest to you as we go through this, there are ways to prevent problems, short term. But if you just use those, you're not solving anything. You're just delaying it for someone else to deal with. Okay? And what's happening in positive behavioral support now is too often we're stopping here. Okay? We're not moving on to what we really need to do is to get this person ready to live in a world that isn't predictable, to get this person ready to deal with work that is difficult. Not that you're going to have to work with difficult work all the time, but you're going to get faced with it. What do you do? Okay, you can't just change the world. We'd like to, can't. So we're going to need to do something else. And so that's why I'm going to spend most of my time talking about replacement. But again, be careful. I was in a program in New York City that works with kids with deaf blindness, and there's a young girl with her head next to music, a speaker. And I watched her and watched her and watched her and watched her, and basically all day she was listening to music. So I said, well, what's the plan for her? You know, what do you want to do? Well, what we have is this whole elaborate series, and then what she does, she gets choices. She gets to choose what she wants to do during the day. And that was primarily to help reduce some behavior problems. Well, she always chooses music. So we don't teach her anything. They didn't say, use those words, but that's what was happening, is that she's only just listening to music. Is that what you really wanted? Is that what you wanted to happen? That's maybe taking choice a little too far. Choice is good. Choice is very important. We'll talk about choice. But if you take it too far, the crisis is over, she's not getting upset, and now no one's thinking, what's in store for this kid who now just can only sit and listen to music all day? Okay, so keep that in mind. Let's talk about a model. Again, I'll go through this relatively quickly because this may be familiar to some of you, but we need to really have the same kind of language here. Why do people engage in behavior problems? Sometimes it's for attention. That's what I was taught 20 plus years ago. People engage in behavior problems to get attention. Sometimes people do it to get what you might consider negative attention. I'll use an old example because this is, it's really striking. We had an individual who had a toileting problem. He wet his pants. Okay, you don't typically think of that as a behavior problem. Well, back in the old days, what we did for him, we got a consultant to come in and they designed an overcorrection program. People remember overcorrection? Anybody remember overcorrection programs? The overcorrection program was that if he wet his pants, what you had to do was go get a mop, put it in his hands, you'd stand behind him and put your hands over his hands and make him mop up the floor for about 25 minutes. I did this in a program that was in Northern Virginia. If you've ever been to Northern Virginia in August, Northern Virginia in August, it's not a great place to be. You think it's hot here in August, but when it's hot and there's also 98% humidity, it's like an armpit, right? So, you know, it's 98 degrees, 98% humidity. You know, he wets his pants and you have to do this overcorrection with him. I'll never forget, one day his pants were wet, I mean, from the belt down to his shoes. And staff are looking at him, looking at him, looking at him. Finally, one says to the other, well, maybe he's just sweating. Why? Because they didn't want to do this, but they did it. And when they did that program, when they did an overcorrection program, every time he wet his pants more. Okay? Now, this was kind of unclear at the time until one day we were in a meeting and we were bang, 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 bang on the window. People run on the other side to find out what's going on, just in time to watch this guy pull his pants down, urinate on the floor, look up at us and smile. And you sit there and go, what's wrong with him? People were saying, he's a masochist. He wants to be punished. Well, I was behaviorally trained, and we know you don't want to be punished, you want to be reinforced. What was he getting out of this? He got attention. Okay? Now, it wasn't attention in our mind. In fact, you had to go through 7 levels of approval to get approval to do this program that we thought were this horrible punishment. For him, it was better than being ignored. Okay? And keep that in mind. I once went to a school, and people now learning about this about me here, I didn't pay much attention to the details. So I walked into school and I realized I didn't know which classroom I was supposed to go into. I knew the teacher's name, but I didn't know which room number. And then I listened for a second and I hear, no, stop that, put that down. And I thought, well, that's where I'm supposed to go. And as I'm walking to the classroom listening to the teacher screaming at this kid, the first thought that came into my mind was, this is an attention-getting behavior problem. Why? Because it's working. Okay? She's spending the whole time screaming at this kid. It's either to get the teacher's attention, or now the peers are going, wow, you know, he's the center of attention. Something to keep in mind, that in people engage in behavior problems to get attention, it isn't always just kind of warm fuzzies. Sometimes it is to get yelled at, but in some senses to be the center of attention. Escape. Some people engage in behavior problems, as I mentioned before, because things are too difficult for them and they want to escape or avoid it. Sometimes things are too boring. Periodically when I give talks, people get up and walk out. That's called escape behavior. You at some point say, don't want this anymore. We actually, and I mentioned that, there will be some people who get up and walk out because you can't sit too long, because for whatever reason. We engage in escape behaviors all the time. It's not bad to engage in escape behaviors. We do it when things are unpleasant. If you're at a party and someone, those people that talk to you with their face right up against your face, and you kind of back up and you back and they keep walking really close. So then you go, oh, I have to go do this. That's an escape behavior. That's okay. If, however, you bit your hand and screamed and was flailing on the floor like that, that would be inappropriate. What's inappropriate is what you did, not why you did it. Okay? So individuals that we work with often engage in behavior problems for appropriate reasons, but do it in an inappropriate way. So if your work is too difficult, I'll give you an example. I worked with a guy once. His teacher was working with him, and he had some pretty good skills. He was doing sight vocabulary, so very rudimentary sight vocabulary. So she'd hold up a card with the word car on it and the word truck on it. So she'd sit across from this guy. He was kind of tall, thin guy. And she'd say, let me just show you what's going on. So she'd hold up the card. She goes, point to the word car. And he'd lean over and smack her in the head. Okay? So she stood him up, ran down the hall, threw him in a timeout room, closed the door. He's got to be in there 10 minutes. Okay. Takes him back out after 10 minutes, sits him down. She was good. I mean, she really was good because she didn't hold a grudge. Her face is kind of swollen and red. She held up the card very brightly, point to the word car. And he leans over and smacks her in the head again. She runs him down the hall, puts him in a timeout room. He goes, it's 10 minutes. I don't think this is working though. Okay. Take him back. I said, let me sit with him. I sat down across from him and said, point to the word car. And he kind of looked at me, looked at her, looked at me, and then he smacked me in the head. And then he stood up, and he was ready to go down the hall for his 10-minute break. I said, no, sit down. Took his finger, point to the word car. Good. Now you can sit by yourself for a while. What happened? What happened was either this was too difficult for him or it was too boring, but he found out if I hit her, I get out of it. I don't have to do it. Okay? I get to go and hang out for 10 minutes in a separate room. In fact, it got to the point where when they started to bring him back to the room, he would begin to hit them, so they would put him back into timeout. Again, in the teacher's mind, this was a horrible intervention. They had to get approval from the parents, they had to get approval from everybody. This is a terrible punishment. For some kids it would be. For him, it was actually reinforcing. That's what he wanted, was 10 minutes of not having to work. Okay? What did I do? What I did was said, if you worked, you can be by yourself for a while. Okay? It's not bad to want to take a break. It's not bad to help you. What's bad is hitting people to do that. Okay? So escape is an important consideration in behavior problems. You need to be aware of that. Tangible, sometimes people engage in behavior problems to get things. It may be to get soda, it may be to get food, it may be because I want to go outside and play now, whatever it is, people engage in behavior problems to get things. In my book, I talk about a case where I worked with a really big guy. And I was asking people who work with him, why do you think he's being very aggressive? He would headbutt. So he'd get very upset, and then if you try to come near him, he'd hit you with his head, which put people in the hospital. was a serious behavior problem. So I'm following them around and we're talking, and then they were going on a trip. They were going to get on a van and go on a trip. And they were very good. They had a little checkoff list. So they had, everybody's names, and this person got on the van, this person got off the van. And on the bottom of the checkoff list, they had a line for Bill's Magazine. So I said, well, what's that? They got all embarrassed and said, well, a couple of weeks ago we were on a van ride, got about 20 minutes away, and Bill started saying, magazine, magazine. So I turned, to my friend and said, get him his magazine. And she looked at me in horror and said, oh my God, I thought you had the magazine. So we locked arms, put everybody in the back of the van, turned around 20 minutes, went back to get the magazine. It was something about swimming in a sports magazine. I don't know anything about it. It was special edition sports magazine. Why did they go back? They went back because he was about to beat them all up. Why was he going to beat them up? Not to get attention, not to escape, but he wanted this thing. Periodically, they would say, no, you can't have it. We have to stop giving in to him. We have to stop doing this. And he would, as if to say, well, perhaps you didn't understand me. Maybe I haven't made myself clear. Now, he wouldn't do that by saying those words, but he would do that with his behavior. And he would escalate and escalate until they said, get him the magazine. People engage in behavior problems sometimes to get things. It's not bad to want things. It's bad to beat people up to get things. Some behaviors occur because it sounds good, feels good, tastes good. Why does someone do this? Well, you could have pretty detailed biological, neuropsychological models, but at some level, I do this because it looks good. Okay? The light flickers, if you'd want to try it later on. It just looks good to do it. We need sensory input. We absolutely need sensory input. We have adaptive ways of doing things. The individuals that we work with often don't have adaptive ways to get sensory input when they're not getting it the way they need it. A friend of mine is paraplegic. He has no use of his arms or legs, and he's a clinical psychologist. And the problem he has is when he's in therapy with somebody and the person is boring, he falls asleep. Okay? It's not good for business. It's like you're spilling your guts out and he's... but he can't do anything else. You start to shut down if you're not getting input. In fact, one of the things that you try to teach people as teachers is vary your input. We have a guy at the university who teaches like this. He paces around and he goes, today, what we will do is talk about Diet Pepsi. Now, you can't fall asleep in that class because you're kind of startled all the time. Well, you need sensory input, and some behaviors occur for sensory input. Now, some people question, could self-injury occur for sensory input? Wouldn't that just hurt, and wouldn't they just stop? Why do people do that? Well, the best example I can give you is if you've ever had a toothache, and you kind of play with it with your tongue. Why do you do that? Doesn't it hurt? Well, at some level it hurts, but at some level we like sensory input. Some people pull out their hair, by the way, in the back, this is a beard. Some of the people in the front are going. You laugh, but I actually had someone, a faculty member, a week ago, said, are you trying to grow a beard? Yeah, for 20 years now. So we need this, and we'll engage in kind of behaviors to get input. Some of the individuals that we work with will play with strings, will play with saliva. They'll do things sometimes just for the sensory input. Why do we need to know that? We need to know that in part because just ignoring it, it's not going to go away. Because it's self-reinforcing. It's going to keep going no matter what we do, whether we ignore it or not. So you have to know why it's occurring to know what to do. Okay. Quickly. That's not the only, these are 4 reasons are not the only reasons why people engage in behavior problems. There's a whole set of other influences that we can call setting events. I'm not going to talk about them in great detail other than to talk about 2, one of which is mood. We've done a series of studies now on mood. For years, teachers have told us, I can tell when he comes in off the bus what kind of day it's going to be. Okay? I look at his face and I can say, oh, it's going to be a good day. Or I look at his face and say, oh, I should have called in sick today. You know, this is going to be a bad day. He's got the devil in his eyes. This is going to be bad. They've told us about mood. Now, again, I told you I'm somewhat behaviorally trained. You don't really pay attention to mood, which is something inside, when you're behaviorally trained. So that really hasn't been studied, how someone's internal feelings could affect them. So what we wanted to do was study it, say how would a person's mood affect their behavior problems. The problem is a lot of the kids that we work with are not verbal, so they can't do some of the things that the mood induction people do, which is if you want to induce a mood, one way to do that is to have them imagine certain things. So imagine you're on a deserted island. Okay, you're on a chair. The only sound is the sound of waves crashing at your feet. There's no phone. There's no beeper. No one asking for anything. Then you hear the kind of tinkling sounds. Yeah, now people are going, why am I not there? Glass with ice in it, little umbrella, favorite drink. Someone's giving this to you now. Imagine that scenario. Then you sit there and you're in a positive mood. Okay, you can't do that with the kids that we work with because you don't know what they're thinking about. So what we did actually was go to music. Music is kind of a neat thing. If you study mood induction in music, what you find is you can kind of condense the influence of music down to its beats. Okay? So if I told you I'm going to play 2 types of music, happy music and sad music. And I'm just going to show you the beats, and you tell me whether that's happy or sad. Happy. Sad. Okay? I was at a funeral recently, and what kind of music do they play at funerals? So you're sad already, and then they play music that makes you even sadder. It's a bizarre trick, unless, like part of my family background, you're Irish, in which time they play music like this, and then they give you beer to drink, and so you don't care anymore. If you go throughout the world and play musical selections based on beat, if you play slow beat music, people will appear sad. If you play fast beat music, people will appear happy, no matter where you go. Right. Okay. What we did here was to look at behavior problems in 3 individuals, put them in a situation that they would tend to engage in behavior problems. So for example, if they had escape-motivated behavior problems, we gave them difficult work, you'd see behavior problems there. If they were tangibly motivated, meaning they'd get upset if they couldn't get this, we wouldn't let them have it. Then what we did was played either slow beat music or fast beat music. Slow beat music, fast beat music, slow beat music, fast beat. What we found was that if we played fast beat music, the positive music, the behavior problems would go down. Okay? What this suggests is mood doesn't cause behavior problems. Mood's not going to solve behavior problems, but mood can mitigate behavior problems. It can be worse if you're in a bad mood. It can be better if you're in a good mood. Okay? So again, it's not that being in a bad mood is what's making me hit myself. Being in a bad mood, now that you're asking me to do something I don't want to do, makes it worse. Being in a bad mood, now that you're asking me to not have a lot of attention, makes it worse. So what we're actually doing now is using mood induction to try to help mitigate some problems. So sometimes we use music. Again, we don't use music all day long, but if we know this kid has, he's going to have a long bus ride to get here, and he comes in cranky, can we do some positive mood induction as the first thing coming in? Kind of a transition. Now this should make some sense to you because you do this all the time. In fact, you created this conference with the positive mood induction transition. You didn't come in, sit at a table, and start to work. You came in, you had a cup of coffee, you can't even have toasters out there. I've never been at a conference where you had toasters. That is unique. You could toast bagels. This is pretty cool. You talked, you hung out, and then you began. What we do during the day is find ways to do this. What people do now often, how many of you use email? How many of you that use email check your email the first thing in the morning? Part of that is just to get you going. Okay, it's kind of not a big deal. You can check your email. It's like reading the newspaper. It's like having that cup of coffee. It transitions you into the day. We're trying to use these things to transition people into the day. We have, I mentioned Deaf-Blind Project. We're working with a group and trying to see if, because they can't hear, can we use olfactory cues to induce positive mood. We're also looking at social interventions. There's a phenomenon called emotion contagion. Emotion contagion is a phenomenon where you pick up on the mood or the emotion of another people. So if I came in here really, hi, it's great to be here. What time do I have to talk to? 4? Okay. Is it time for a break yet? I'm sorry, but I'm just not up to it today. You'd think that was kind of odd, and then you'd get depressed, okay? We pick up on the emotions of other people. Now think about it. You're working with a kid, and you come in and say, this is going to be a bad day. Well, you know what? It is going to be a bad day, in part because you're going to make it a bad day, okay? Does your emotion get transferred to the children that you work with? So if you come in and say, we had a bad day yesterday, but we're going to have a good day today, okay? I don't care what happens, we're going to have a good day today. Does that emotion get picked up, and does that help mediate some of the behavior problems? So we're actually starting a study now to look at does this happen, and can we begin to help with behavior problems? Mood induction is a short-term prevention strategy. It's not what we would do to change the behavior problem long-term, but it's a way to get through things. So this is a really hard situation for this kid. We're going to go into speech therapy, and he hates speech therapy. It's too hard for him. He gets really upset. Can we transition him in a positive way so it makes it easier? What can we do to make this easier for this kid? Okay, coming in the morning, devil in his eyes, mood induction time. Okay, instead of going right to work, let's do something else. I'll give you an example. I was observing a kid once who was clearly physically ill. Looked like he had a fever, looked like he's trying to throw up. This kid was in bad shape. And the teacher kept pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. Why? Didn't want the kid to win. Okay, didn't want the kid to give up. Now I said to them, I said, what would happen if a kid sneezed in regular ed? I know there's at least one regular ed teacher here. Where are you? If you got a kid who's sick in a regular ed class, what do? Go to the nurse, right. Immediately you escape. Okay, no demands are going to be placed on you now. Demands are done for the day. You get one-to-one attention from the school nurse. You might get soda or juice or something, some nice tangible things, and then get on the phone to the parents, say, pick this kid up because we don't want a sick kid in this school. In special ed, we keep them there. Okay? We're tough. What's happened is we learned that at certain points, this is a bad situation. This is not going to go anywhere. We're not going to make progress today. We probably shouldn't push this kid. Okay? Let alone the physical issues about getting better. We're not going to have a very productive day. We don't think about that sometimes, and we think we need to get through this task instead of thinking probably, maybe today we back off. Okay. Sleep. It wasn't a request. It was a topic. Very briefly, like mood, sleep deprivation can affect behavior problems. Okay? If you're not sleeping well, this can be a problem. I was consulting with a case once, and I couldn't go to them, so they came to me. And kid had lots of aggression, non-compliance, irritable. So they brought a videotape. And mother was there, the teacher was there. We put the videotape in the VCR, turned the tape on, watched the tape for 10 seconds, turned the tape off. Looked at the mom and said, "He's not sleeping well, is he?" She goes, "Oh my gosh, no, he's not. How did you know that? You know, he's up half the night, most nights. How did you know that?" The teacher says, "He's not sleeping at night? I didn't know he didn't sleep at night. Why didn't you tell me he didn't sleep at night?" And then they both turned to me again and they looked at me like I was God and said, "How did you know that?" Now for a second, I thought, this is really good. I could say, you know, well, I'm a brilliant clinician and, you know, 25 years of experience, I can just look at a child for 10 seconds and instantly diagnose whatever problem is there. But then the rational side of my brain took over and I said, well, he looked tired. Why didn't the teacher pick that up? The teacher didn't pick it up because tired looked like his problem. He was irritable. Sometimes he was hyperactive. When you're very tired, sometimes you can be hyperactive. He was non-compliant. They had to drag him through things. When they would drag him through things, he would hit them. Okay? What was going on? Part of what was going on was this kid was sleep deprived. Okay? So what we've done is, one, tried to test it out like the mood. And one of the ways you can, there are kind of two ways to test out whether sleep affects behavior problems. One is to ask a parent of a child who has behavior problems, can we come to your home and wake your kid up several times each night for a couple of weeks to see if it makes the behavior problems worse? No, we wouldn't do that. So we did the opposite. What we did was said, take a kid with behavior problems who already has sleep problems and fix the sleep problems. If we fix the sleep problems, then the behavior problems should get better. Okay, and what we found, which I think I have here, this is one of the interventions that we did. What we found is that we could do that, and behavior problems would be reduced. They wouldn't be eliminated. So it's not like sleep problems or mood or being sick causes you to have behavior problems, but it helps make it work. Let me just point this out. This is one of the interventions that we did. I will have nowhere near enough time to talk about sleep. I was telling Dan I could talk for a day about sleep and sleep problems. And it just might seem like a day to you. But what we did here in this case, we had a little girl who wouldn't go to sleep at night, would tantrum at night. When she'd finally fall asleep, she'd wake up several times during the night, tantruming, screaming. It was so bad that her father, who was a surgeon, would not sleep at home because he couldn't get a full night's sleep. So he'd sleep at the hospital. This was obviously causing problems in the family because the father wasn't there at night. And they were thinking about residential placement for this girl, in part because of a sleep disruption. So what we did here is actually sleep restriction. This was her normal sleep time, 7:30 to 6:15 with awakenings. We actually kept her up later, 8:30 to 7, kept her up an hour later, and let her sleep less. And the analogy that we give to parents is, for sleep restriction, is it's kind of like when you have a computer problem and you don't know what's wrong. Sometimes what you do is turn it off and then turn it back on again and things are fixed. Sometimes we're rebooting their sleep. We're making them sleep less, keeping them up, making them sleep deprived, and then letting them sleep longer over a series of weeks. Let me just go back. So we did this intervention for her, and we've worked now with large numbers of children, and have found that if you fix sleep problems, they're sleeping better, they're easier to work with during the day, they're less irritable, we see improvements. So it's something to consider. I mentioned the case before, the VCR, because oftentimes parents don't tell teachers about sleep problems. Sometimes parents are very embarrassed to talk about what happens at night. There are many people who have their kids sleep in bed with them and don't want to tell other people that. We have parents that sleep on the floor next to their child's bed, so when the child wakes up in the middle of the night, they can be there to stop them from acting up too much and waking up the rest of the house. There are lots of things that parents think are unique to their families and are very bizarre until we can bring them together in groups and they find out you do that too. It's very difficult sometimes for them to handle this and to tell people about it. The other problem is there are not many people who know how to help them, which is why we wrote the book to provide assistance. Just as an overview, there are 88 identifiable sleep problems. Kids with disabilities can have any one of them. They don't tend to have different sleep problems, but they have them more frequently. Okay, so they're more likely to have sleep problems than kids without disabilities. And when we look at sleep problems, we do an assessment, just like I'm going to talk about next for behavior problems. We have to assess what kind of a sleep problem is this, and that tells us how to intervene on sleep. Denise bites her hand. That's all we used to care about. Okay, Denise bites her hand, how do we get her to stop? Well, now we're beginning to look at what happened before it. The teacher made a request and Denise bit her hand. But that's important to know because it might be that Denise is biting her hand to avoid responding to the request. This tells us more. The teacher stops making the request. So maybe it's working. If I make a request and the kid bites their hand and I stop making requests, they're getting out of it. It's escape. Well, now we're going to expand it a little bit. Suppose you have something like insufficient sleep, or being in a bad mood, or being ill. What that's going to do is influence this, which will influence that. Okay? Not getting enough sleep again, being in a bad mood, being sick, doesn't make you bite your hand. Not getting enough sleep may make the request more difficult to deal with. Okay, so we still can intervene here. And this is important. We deal a lot with kids who might have chronic illnesses. And people say, well, the reason why they engage in these behavior problems is because of their chronic illness. So until we can resolve the chronic illness, we can't do anything. That's not true. We can intervene here to help even people who have these kind of mood problems, sleep problems that we can't change. Insufficient sleep makes the request more difficult. And again, you know this. If you haven't gotten sleep for a couple of nights, that person that you work with that you find annoying is going to be more annoying to you now, and you're going to be less tolerant. Often, inadvertently, we don't realize this, we change the way we do things. Okay? So I might stop asking her to do what I just asked her to do, but I also might ask her to do less over time. Okay? Because I'm learning, maybe not consciously, but I'm learning, don't do this. We had a guy once who, I came into a room and I looked at him and immediately said, it's probably escape-motivated behavior problems. Why did I say that? I said it because everybody else is sitting at tables. He's sitting at a table in the corner of the room by himself. A few seconds go by. Well, everybody else is working on some academic work. He's looking at a magazine. Teacher then goes to give him a new magazine, gives it to him like this. Then it's lunchtime, and they said, okay, time for everybody to go down to the cafeteria for lunch. And teacher says to the aide, take John to lunch. She goes, I'm not taking him to lunch. I took him last time. She goes, no, I took him last time. No, I took him last time. I had green Jell-O all over my head, remember? What happened? what happened was, in fact, these teachers were considered the best teachers he's ever had because he was best behaved in their classroom. What was happening? Well, they learned if we put him in the corner, he does better. Fewer demands. If we don't make him work on what everybody else is working on, he does better. Fewer demands. They were getting to the point now where they didn't even want to ask him to stand up to go down the cafeteria because that was a demand on him. They were going to bring him his lunch into the classroom so they didn't have to ask him to stand up because he was going to get upset. Over time, they were adapting their behavior to him. Okay? And this is something you have to be aware of. Oftentimes I'll see teachers who have kids with attention-getting behavior problems. That kid's always in the front. That kid, teacher's never more than about 3 feet away from this kid because they know if I go to the other side of the room, a problem will occur. And they're not thinking I'm doing something wrong, may not even be cognitively aware of what they're doing, but this just works out better. This is one of those short-term prevention strategies, but it's not a long-term solution. Okay. Okay, functional assessment. When I was here 10 years ago, whenever it was, we were trying to get people to do functional behavioral assessment. You go workshop to workshop, person to person. Took that away from me, thank you. Got it. I'm in great shape. Trying to get people to do this. Then in 1997, wake up one morning and find out that the federal government, in the reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, said everybody has to do a functional behavioral assessment under certain circumstances. One level, it was like Christmas. It was like getting everything you ever asked for. That lasted for about 15 minutes. And then I realized, oh my God, these people don't know how to do this. And what you find when you go around the country and you talk to people and say, do you do functional behavioral assessments? Most people say, of course we do. And then I say, what do you do? And I get different answers from everybody I talk to. The federal government didn't say how to do a functional behavioral assessment. They just said you should do one. They also said you should do something like positive behavioral supports. They didn't tell anybody what that was. Okay? We are kind of up in the air now, and we have a lot of people from special ed and regular ed that have to deal with this issue now. If you have a kid, even out of the special ed system, who has severe behavior problems, there are certain circumstances where you have to do a functional behavioral assessment. Very quickly, let me just do some terminology. Functional assessment or functional behavioral assessment is a class of intervention, a class of assessments that underneath it includes lots of different things. One of them is something called a functional analysis. And a functional analysis is basically an experiment. Okay? You are doing an experiment live with a child to see what makes this behavior problem better or worse. So if I were to turn the lights down and counted how many times you bit your hand, and then I put the lights back up again and counted how many times you bit your hand, and put the lights back down again, that would be a functional analysis. I would be changing something in the environment to see how it affected behavior problems. So if I gave you difficult work to do, counted how many times you screamed, then gave you easy work to do, counted how many times you screamed, that would be a functional analysis. Now, the problem with functional analysis is it can be fairly time-consuming. It can be pretty cumbersome. There are also circumstances where you really wouldn't want to do it. One of the circumstances is if it's going to make a behavior problem worse, that you really don't want it to be worse. I worked with a girl once who banged her head on the corner of tables. Hard. Now, you can't do a functional analysis and say, okay, well, when I gave her this hard work, she banged her head 15 times, and then when I gave her the easy work, she only banged it twice, so it's hard work. I can't justify having her do serious damage. I was at another place and I had to work with someone, this was my favorite behavior. They called it elope. She eloped. When they first said it, I thought, well, isn't that romantic? You know? That's really nice. She eloped. Elopement means to run away, and that's what she was doing. She was running away, and she was running out into the street, and we couldn't do a functional analysis and say, okay, if we do this, she runs out in the street 5 times. Hopefully she didn't get hit by a car or a truck. There are certain times you can't do that. So a lot of the functional assessments are really geared towards observing things either as they are or to try to get information indirectly. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. In your handouts that I gave you, we talked about ABC charts. I just want to take a minute to talk about it. That's where you would write down the behavior, what happened before it, and what happened afterwards, the antecedents and the consequences. Real time. So let me show you what this looks like. Here's the chart you have. You would write the behavior down, you would write what happened before it, and you'd write what happened afterwards, because what you're trying to do is look for patterns. Is there a pattern here? Here's a typical one. Well, thank you for laughing. She screamed. What happened before? Nothing. I ignored it. She hit nothing. I ignored it. She hit nothing. She screamed. Then they get really lazy and push these hash marks down. This is useless information. Okay? Why? Well, first of all, something happened before. You know, they were working, they weren't working. You were with them, you weren't with them. Just lost my mic. You said they couldn't go outside. Something happened before it. What's wrong with this? Well, I ignored it. Does that mean you were working with her, she screamed, and you turned away to ignore the screaming? Does that mean you were working with her, she screamed, and you kept working with her as if it wasn't happening? Those are two different things, and they'll have two different outcomes. Here's a better one. She pinched me. What happened before? I asked her to sit down. I walked away from her. She was told to go back to work. She kicked another student. I sent her out of the room. I was working with her on her math. She scratched my arm. I sent her to the principal's office. Principals, by the way, love this. Any principals here? School principals? Yeah, they're too embarrassed. I was in Hawaii in a convention of school principals. So almost all the school principals in Hawaii were there. And you know how you can tell? I'm going to make fun of all the other groups too, so don't feel like you're being picked on. But you can tell. I walked in the room and no one had to tell me it was a room full of school principals, because you see 200 people sitting like this. Like, prove it to me. And they were kind of not really paying much attention. I was probably having a difficult time too, because the room was kind of set like this, and in the back was all glass, and it overlooked the pool. And I was in Hawaii, and I never got outside during the daytime. So here I was watching, 200 faces like this, and beyond them there are people doing this. So it wasn't going great until I mentioned something about this, and then they all perked up, because then they realized sending the kid to the principal's office could actually be reinforcing. It could be making the problem worse. And that's what was happening. She, even coming back to the room from the principal's office, slapped another student, and I sent her back to the office. It's escape. Okay, so for some kids, this can be a problem. Now, how do you get someone to fill out a chart like this? One way to do this is to give them the background I talked to you about. You need to know what you're looking for. We're looking to see if it might be escape motivated, looking to see if it might be attention getting, looking to see if it might be tangible. We're looking for these kinds of patterns, so I want to know, did you just ask them to do something? Or I hadn't talked to them in 5 minutes, or I was working on this difficult task. And similarly here, what the consequence is, something that kind of fits in. Did you pay attention to it? Did they escape? Did they get something that they wanted? You said, no, you can't play with that now. They scream, and you end up giving it back to them. That could be the pattern that you're looking for. ABC charts can be helpful. We use them. We don't use them alone. And this is an important point. Assessment, like any assessment, you do multiple forms of assessment. Okay, so you never rely on just one method to do an assessment. Scatter plots, which you have on the second page there. This is where you indicate instances of behaviors across days. This is what you have there. I'll show you one filled out. Here, Monday. If you can't see this in the back, this says Monday, 7 a.m. to 11:30. One instance of a behavior problem, one instance. Multiple instances here between 8:30 and 9, or 8:30 and 9:30. No behavior problems here, some behavior problems here, lots of behavior problems here. What you do with the scatter plot as a functional behavioral assessment technique is two things. One is to look where are behavior problems occurring, and is there a pattern? Do they occur more often at certain times, at certain activities? So here, any speech therapists here? This is your time. I'm not making fun of anybody, but sometimes people get upset. This was speech therapy. Now, the speech therapist was embarrassed because she said, why are there more problems when I'm working with her? Well, first of all, working with him, I don't make judgments. In fact, it was very useful information because I know this was the period of time where the most demands were being placed on him. Okay, so there were lots of frequent requests for information, lots of demands, and we saw more behavior problems, which suggests it may be demand related. It might be that this is escape motivated. Then we look at when is it not occurring. That's very important. One of the first questions I'll often ask a teacher or a parent is, can you imagine a situation where this child will not engage in behavior problems? And sometimes they'll go, oh, of course. If I just let him sit by himself in the corner reading a magazine, he'll be fine. That's important information. That tells me, first of all, it's not attention getting, because she just told me it's by himself. Maybe it's escape motivated because it's away from everybody. Maybe it's tangible because he wants a magazine. So it gives me ideas. In your packets, you have something called the Motivation Assessment Scale 2. This is another way to do a functional assessment. Again, this is something that we designed, but it's not the only thing we do. Okay, we don't just rely on one form of assessment to do a functional assessment. We use multiple forms of assessment. One thing, though, is just as a warning, we discourage people from relying on the most common way that people do this. The most common way people do this is called clinical intuition, otherwise known as guessing. So you're in a meeting and someone goes, well, I've been in the field for 55 years and I've never seen this child, but from my observations of your discussion, it's occurring for this reason. Everybody takes notes and writes that down. Do you remember the 4 categories? Attention, escape, tangible, sensory. We did a study once where we asked people to guess. Which of those 4 do you think is going on? No formal assessment, just guess. People were correct, and this is people who knew the individual, people were correct about 25% of the time. Now, if you know about statistics, might be a while since you've been in a statistics class, but you know about statistics, a chimpanzee could be right 25% of the time because that's chance. You have to pick one, you're going to be right 25% of the time. So guessing is okay. You can guess as a start to give you some ideas, but you better not just be guessing. Okay? Because if you're just guessing, you're going to be wrong a lot. What's wrong with being wrong a lot? If you're wrong a lot, you're beginning an intervention process that takes a lot of people's time, a lot of effort, and you're going to be wrong. So you want to do as much as you can up front to try to get the answers. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be right 100% of the time, no matter how many assessments you do, but you're going to be right more often if you take a little bit more time. So we use ABC charts, we use observations, we use the motivation assessment scale, we try to see, do they give us the same information, do they converge on each other? If we come up with the same information using multiple assessments, then we have a pretty good idea. So think about if you have somebody that you want to design an intervention for, you have a behavior. Now, why just one behavior? One behavior because, well, let me ask you this. Could you fill out this scale on a tantrum? Why not? A lot of behaviors can make up a tantrum, okay? For example, we had a kid who his teacher said, we're working on her tantrums and we've done different interventions and they work a little bit, but sometimes they don't work well. Well, the tantrum included hand biting, screaming, falling on the floor, and running around the room. When we did separate assessments on those behaviors, we found out that she bit her hand and fell on the floor to escape work, and she screamed and ran around the room to get attention. So that tantrum, all of those together, actually were two separate functions. When we separated them out, we found out that she was doing different things. So what you want to try to do is separate them out into something like a hand bite, like a scream, like hitting somebody. One of the best examples, we get this a lot in New York City when we do assessments, is having an attitude. He has an attitude. Okay, you can't fill out the scale on having an attitude. What do you mean by that? Well, you know, when I ask him to do something, he does this. And I know this, having a 16-year-old son, I know exactly what they're talking about. But, I'll say, okay, what we're going to do is fill this out for eye rolling and sign. Well, it's not just that. Sometimes he takes the table and flips it over. Separate one out for flipping over tables. Well, sometimes he curses. Separate one for cursing. Why separate behaviors, separate assessments? Because they may be occurring for different reasons. Okay, so that's important. The other thing to notice is you're going to pick a specific setting. So you might pick hand biting or you might pick screaming. You're not going to do that all day long. You're going to pick a particular setting. And the reason why you're going to pick a particular setting is I might bite my hand in speech therapy to get out of work. And I might bite my hand in groups to get attention. So I could do the same behavior to get different things in different settings. So what you want to do is first narrow it down to what's the behavior and what's the setting. So what you're going to have to discuss is, what do we want to work on first? What's the particular behavior and what's the particular setting? Now, one way to narrow this down if you have too many behaviors is to say, like I mentioned before, what's the most disruptive? Okay, what's causing the most problem? Give you an example. We walked into a school also in New York, and kids with the most severe emotional disturbances. So there were kids in there that had stabbed people. There were kids in there that had broken into homes, that had done everything. And so we asked them as a test, you know, what's the most severe kid and problem you have right now? Let's focus on that one. And they all looked at each other and nodded, you know, it's Mary. Okay, what is she doing? She's cursing. Cursing? What are you talking about? You know, you've got people stab people here. Why is cursing the most severe problem? They said, you don't understand. Cursing for her is life-threatening. I said, cursing is life-threatening? Because what happens is she walks around the neighborhood, she doesn't distinguish who she's talking to, and she curses them out. It's going to get her killed. Someone's going to kill her because she cursed someone's grandmother, and they're going to do something to her. So we're most afraid for her because of her cursing. And that's what you really want to look for, is at this level, what's the behavior that has the worst consequences? So pick a behavior, pick a setting. If you have multiple behaviors and multiple settings, think of ones that are most problematic. Why don't we give it a try? What you're going to find on the scale is a series of questions that have never, almost never, seldom, half the time, usually, almost always, always. Here's a couple of them. Would the behavior occur continuously over and over if this person was left alone for long periods of time? If you say never, then that's fine. If you say always, that's fine, or anything in the middle. Does the behavior occur following a request to perform a difficult task? Yes, always, or sometimes. You notice that we're not asking for specific numbers. Okay, so we don't say on this questionnaire, when we ask to perform a difficult task, it happens 5 times a week, or 5 times a day, or 5 times an hour, or 5 times a minute. The reason is that this is all relative to the person that you're working with, bless you. It's relative to that person. So if they hit themselves once a week on average, But when I put them in a difficult task, it happens almost every single time, and that's almost always, or always. Okay, so it's relative to how often this person does it. Does the behavior occur in response to talking to other persons in the room? Does the behavior occur to get a toy, food, or activity that this person has been told that he or she can't have? Once you've done this, and again, we're going to talk about a half hour, maybe even a little less. At the end, there's a scoring sheet. You put the number associated with it. So question number 1, you might have put a 6. Question number 2, a 4. Write those answers in. Write the numbers in. What I'm going to ask for you is you're going to have to do math now. You're going to take an average. How many questions? What's the total? And divide by how many questions are on here. Okay? We'll see how much time that takes you. This is a longer version that we normally have. See how long it takes you, and then we'll either talk about it now or we'll talk about it when we do intervention. I promised you some answers to some questions about intervention, so that's what I'm going to do next, is talk about how we intervene for behavior problems. And again, just as an overview, we've talked about assessing the function, and we're going to kind of revisit that in a little bit this afternoon and look at the findings that you have from your assessments. We talked about short-term prevention and some of the problems with short-term prevention. And now what we're going to talk about is replace. How do you replace behavior problems? We went to a local school for kids with developmental disabilities. And my connections here.
I shook it up for you.
Put a log on that fire. Is that what the commercial, how the commercial goes? Like that? Now I'm not going to open it just yet. I'm no fool. We went to a school for kids with developmental disabilities, and we basically said, give us the 3 or 4 most difficult kids that you have. When we do research, oftentimes schools are reluctant to, have us there. But when we do research on behavior problems, they're yours. Tim, Hal, and Ben were the 3 most difficult kids in this school. And unfortunately, they were also in the same classroom in this school. Now, we can talk about why that might not be a good idea, because there are a lot of reasons. We'll maybe get to that later, but they were there. Same classroom, a really good teacher, highly skilled, well-meaning, one of those teachers could get hit in the head 5 times a day and bounce right back the next day and really be in there. So she was great. So Tim, Hal, and Ben, what's the first thing we did?
Do a baseline.
I hear assessment. We did assessment, okay? 2 things, part of it, one was the baseline and one was the functional assessment. So here you see, we were in their classroom, so this is now not a laboratory study. We went into their classrooms, we observed them in the comings and goings of crazy days that people had in a behavior problem classroom. Here you see Tim, about 10% of his day, he was engaged in some form of behavior problems. He would bite his hand, he would scream, he would cry, lots of behaviors like that. Hal, about 20% or more of his day was engaged in behavior problems. He was the kid I mentioned to you before who would slap himself in the face really hard, among other things. Ben, about 20 to 30% of his day engaged in some kind of behavior problems. He would pinch people, he would rip things off the wall, he would run around. He also, by the way, did the worst thing a kid can do. Now, you often wonder, is it self-injury or aggression or screaming? No, the worst thing that a kid can do in a school is to mock the teacher. He would do something and go, ha, 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 ha. Just drove her crazy. He would also, he would go up behind people who had difficulty walking and push them over. But he would do it with such a cute little grin on his face that he never really got in trouble for it. He just would be very cute. So 3 boys with multiple chronic behavior problems. These kids had problems for years. We then did our functional assessment. We did a combination of the motivation assessment scale and a functional analysis where we changed things to look what was going on. For Tim, his were escape motivated. So when he got frustrated and couldn't do something, he would start to cry, bite his hand, scream. Hal, also escape motivated. And Ben, he was what we would call multiply motivated. So some behaviors occurred to escape, some behaviors occurred to get attention. So they made up a really good group of kids. After we did our assessments, what did we do? Okay, what we want to do then is say, if you're doing this to escape, can we give you another way to tell us this? How do you teach that? I'll give you an example. For Tim, if he had trouble putting on his jacket, for example. Jackets, by the way, are these outer clothing that we put on in New York when the temperature gets really cold. Just want to make sure you all understand cultural differences in the United States. So if he had trouble, if he's going to go outside and he had trouble putting on his jacket, he might cry, he might bite his hand, sometimes he'd even fall to the floor and bang his head. So what were we going to do? We wanted to teach him to ask for help. How do you teach him to do that? Well, we did a kind of a modified, this is 20 years ago, we did incidental teaching. And incidental teaching means you find naturally occurring situations that are teaching situations, you use it as an opportunity to teach, and you have natural consequences. It's time to go outside, we say, put your coat on. He put his coat in, and he'd get stuck. Now, we knew he was going to get stuck. And the reason why we knew he was going to get stuck is because I tied a knot in the arm of his jacket. Okay. I am sick. Thank you. By the way, on your feedback form, make sure you mention that I'm sick. Now, just to show you I'm not so terrible, before he got upset, we give him his coat, say, put your coat on, he gets stuck. Before he got upset, and this is really important, we'd prompt him. He'd get stuck, we'd say, help me, help me. Good. Untie the coat, help him with it, send him outside. Next time it's time to go outside, put your coat on. He goes in, gets stuck, because to put the knot back in there. Say, help me, help me. Put it on, send him out, go outside, okay? He doesn't really know what the words help me means. He was somewhat verbal, so he could say the words, he would repeat them, but he doesn't really know what they mean, but we're teaching him now, which means you say these words, things get better. Put your coat on, he'd stick it in. Say, good. Untie the knot, put his jacket on, send him outside. Now, the reason why you said help me, by the way, is part of the trick of teaching this is people get uncomfortable with pauses, and you rely on pauses. I mean, you want to delay a little bit so that you're not just jumping in there. We have a video that I won't show you of a teacher. We were trying to get this kid to be independent and to communicate, and she would always jump in and help him, and we were trying to get her to stop. So he'd be putting his work away in a box, and she'd help him put it away. Like take her aside and say, stop it. Let him do this. Yes, it takes longer. Yes, I know you're uncomfortable, but it's good for him to do it on his own. Same thing with prompts. Sometimes you want to delay. Even though it's a little uncomfortable, it will help them respond. So next time it's time to go outside, put your coat on. He gets stuck, say, too fast. You wait, he says, help me, great, put it on, send you outside. Next time, put your coat on, get stuck. Good, she said, help me, put your coat on. What I'm going to do is quickly fade my prompts. Now, what I don't do in this is wait until you got 90% correct for 100 trials over 2 weeks. No. When he's ready to go, we go. If he's ready to do it on his own, we move ahead. And if he's getting frustrated, we might pull back, okay? Because I don't want him, if you make it too hard, it's just going to be something he's going to try to escape from. So we're going to make it really easy for you. Say, help me go. It's time to tie your shoes. Tie your shoes. Well, he gets stuck. Why did he get stuck? because we put knots in the shoelaces. Okay? Say, help me, help me. All throughout the day, we picked situations that were typically frustrating for him. We set them up, meaning we created the situation, made sure he had a couple of examples of it, taught him, whenever you get in these difficult situations, say, help me. Why not just one situation? Because we want him to generalize. We want him to learn that whenever you get stuck, even in a new situation, if you say these magic words, help me, things will be better. In fact, his teacher said, if you can see here, he used help me a lot. That's what the shaded areas, his use of the phrase help me at first. Teacher would say, what's your name? In the past, he would say Tim. Now, when the teacher says, what's your name? He said, she wasn't too thrilled with us. But the answer was, help him. Okay, well, this is the most important thing for him right now. If we can get him to understand that when you get stuck, when you get frustrated, say, help me, and people help you, you're going to use it throughout the day. Quickly, and we'll talk about later what happens if this doesn't happen, but over the course of a couple of weeks, it went down to an acceptable level. It didn't disappear, him saying, help me, but he didn't ask it now in all situations. He started to understand when he should and should not use it. At the same time, his behavior problems went down. Okay? How? What we taught him was, one of the difficult situations for him was when people would ask him a question and he didn't know the answer to it. So you'd ask him, where do you live? He didn't know how to answer the question, and he'd start to slap himself. So we taught him to say, I don't understand, okay, which made more sense than help me. Okay, so if somebody asks you a question, you don't know the answer to it, say, I don't understand. That's what we do. We say, I don't understand. Someone either repeats the question or simplifies it or whatever. When we taught him to do that, behavior problems go down. For Ben, we taught him to say, help me, like we had with Tim, because he got frustrated in situations. We also taught him to get attention from the teacher, because a lot of his behavior problems were attention getting. The way we did that was we set up in a group, kind of a circle session. We had someone sit behind him, so in a group session, he wouldn't have one-to-one attention. So what we taught him was, when you're in a group and you want attention, basically we prompt him to raise his hand, and then we taught him to say something that would get attention. Now, this is important. What would you say to a teacher to get attention that would work and that wouldn't be annoying? Okay, because if you go like this, teacher, 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 all day long, that's annoying. Teachers don't like that. That would become a behavior problem. So what we did was went into a regular class, and he was about third grade. We went to a third grade class and looked around and said, what do good kids do to get a teacher's attention? Good kids get teachers' attention, but they don't do it by going, come here, come here, come here. They do it by things like, teacher, is this right? Or am I getting this right, or could you help me? They solicit attention, and teachers like to give attention in that way. They like to feel that they're actually helping somebody. So what we taught him to say was, am I doing good work? It was a way to solicit attention from a teacher that we thought would be acceptable. When we did that, his behavior problems went down. We then had a summer break. That's what this break is here. We came back now next year. So this is a pretty long project. This is about a month and a half. This is about 2 or 3 months. This is about 3 or 4 months of baseline. We then intervened in their classrooms. This is their behavior in their classrooms. Then we have a summer break. Summer break, they come back to new classrooms. Why are they in new classrooms? Because they don't have to be in the behavior problem classroom anymore. So they come to the new classrooms. Tim does really well. Ben does really well, but Hal doesn't. Now, I'm always more interested in the kids that don't do well, because that kind of leads to what we do next. Hal, new classroom, new teacher. Teacher asks him a question like, Hal, where do you live? And Hal says, Anniston. Teacher says, Hal, where do you live? Anniston. Hal, where do you live? Anniston. Hal, where do you live? And then you could see him, it was almost like he was thinking to himself, wait, there was something else I used to do. Oh yeah. And then the teacher says, okay, I'll come back when you've calmed down. What happened? Well, Teacher asked him a question he didn't know the answer to. He said, I don't understand, but he didn't say it in a way that the teacher understood him. So the teacher, instead of helping him, asked the question again, asked the question again. He then hit himself, and then she stopped asking. Okay? So he got out of it by hitting himself. So you see the behavior problems come back, and you see him over time not saying, I don't understand anymore. Now at that point, one option was to go teach the teacher. When he says, I understand, you help him. Instead, what we did was a booster session for him. We got him to articulate it more clearly, got him to slow it down, say, I don't understand. Comes back to the classroom, teacher's there, sitting there, I was in the room. She sits down with him, asks him a question like, where do you live? He says, I don't understand. And the teacher goes, oh my goodness. Turns to me and she goes, is that what he's been trying to tell me? I thought he was just perseverating. Is that what he's been trying to tell me? And my answer was, in the best Columbo I could think of, I don't know. She turns back to him and says, you live at 71 Smith Street. Where do you live? 71 Smith Street. Good. We didn't have to teach her how to be a good teacher. She was already a good teacher. He had to communicate clearly. Once he could communicate clearly, she knew what to do. The intervention wasn't time out, it wasn't hitting him, it wasn't reprimanding him, it was helping him when he says, I don't understand. He says, I don't understand, she responds, his behavior problems come back, down. We follow them up one more year, 3-year study now, to see, are they communicating with people appropriately, are people responding to them, are their behavior problems down? Okay, that's the point. I can come up with an intervention that'll work with you, but it won't work with the next person. It won't work out in the community. You need an intervention that's going to work with the world. You don't want to go to McDonald's and have the guy at McDonald's, you have a person who bites their hand. And the guy at McDonald's goes, wait a minute. Operational definition of a hand bite is any time the teeth touch the back of the hand, that's a hand bite. Hop over the counter, restrain them on the floor and say, I'm supposed to hold them here now for 10 minutes. You don't want that for many reasons. It's not going to happen. But the guy at McDonald's will know, if I hold out my hand and say, help me with my change, they'll know how to do that. Okay? And if you're getting frustrated because you can't get a response, you need to teach them the response that they have to get. Okay? What's the world going to respond to? So what we're shooting for is an intervention that not just works in the traditional sense, but works over time and works with people who are not specifically trained. Okay? That's the point. We don't want to have to train the world. Now, some of you are already in settings where you're going to have to train people. What we're trying to do is get beyond that. Let me give you an example. Worked with a woman who was blind. And she could, going to drive you crazy now, but I'm going to walk over here. She could trail, meaning she could find her way around the building, following along. But if there was ever anything in her way, like someone left a chair in her way, if a door was left open, she'd get upset, she'd bite her hand, she'd fall on the ground, she'd bang her head on the floor. So they couldn't let her just walk around the building because she'd engage in behavior problems. So what did we do? Well, we taught her how to communicate for help. Now, I'm reaching in my pocket to pull something out. I'm always afraid about what I'm going to pull out. One time I pulled out cheese. I had some wrapped cheese in my pocket. Why I had wrapped cheese, I don't know, but it was there. Anyway, what we did for her was, we're going to teach her, now she was blind, she wasn't verbal, we were going to teach her how to ask for help. So what do? Well, we sent her trailing, and we deliberately put things in her way. She gets stuck. As soon as she gets stuck, before she gets upset, we put something in her hand that says, help me. Tap her hand, she gives it back to us, we move the chair out of the way, we send her on her way. Further down the hall, another obstacle. Maybe the door is left open. She gets stuck. Put this in her hand, tap her hand. She gives it back. She was also deaf, by the way, so we didn't use verbal prompts. Tapped her hand, she gave it back to us, sent her on her way. Then we faded the prompts. She gets stuck, we put this in her hand, we tap her hand, but we move our hand away. So she has to search a little bit. Finds our hand, gives it back to us. Next time, put it in her hand, tap her hand, move her hand a little bit further away. Two things happen here. One is she has to search, another thing she has to wait. Okay, we're trying to build in now a delay, that we're not going to be able to respond immediately, but if you persist, you'll get help. Did this over the period of a couple of weeks, probably a couple of months, got her to the point where she'd reach into her pocket, pull this out, and do this. And she could wait for a minute or so. So we sent her down the hall. This was the test. Put a chair in the way, send her down the hall, she gets stuck, she reaches in, she does this. And she waits. She waits. And one of the secretaries came by, looks at it, says, help me. She goes, oh, honey, is that chair in the way? Let me move it. Boom. Okay, what happened? The secretary didn't know anything about deaf blindness. She didn't know anything about augmentative communication systems. She didn't know anything about autism, severe behavior problems, but she knew if someone is communicating, help me, you look around to see what it might be, and you try to help. Okay? That's what we were trying to do. We're trying to get her, the woman who was deaf and blind, to be able to communicate to the world what she needed, instead of trying to anticipate everything. And this kind of goes back to the prevention issue I talked about, the short-term prevention issue I talked about before. We could have, every time we sent her out, sent someone out ahead, moved all the chairs away, made sure all the doors were closed, made sure all that happened. We could have done that, and that would have solved the problem in that building. But she was going to find an obstacle somewhere else. And what we really need to do is teach her, what do you do when you have an obstacle? Okay? You're going to find it. And the world isn't an easy place that you can rearrange like that. So you're going to find it. We need to build this in so that you know how to deal with it when it happens. Okay? We need to find a way for them to deal with the world. We're not going to change the world the way we want to, so we need to find a way for them to deal with the world. This is part of a large study that we did to look at this phenomenon again. We had two groups of kids. We took basically all kids who had attention-getting behavior problems. People would get upset when they didn't have attention. We split them into two groups. One group who got a traditional timeout. So if you get upset, we're going to turn away. And these are the second part of the study. What we did was found a naive teacher. In New York, there is one. We found basically teachers, and we didn't tell them what we were doing. So what we said was, could you work with this kid on this task, but didn't say anything about a behavior problem. And kids, all of them had behavior problems. We then put them with the timeout trainer. They used timeout and the behavior problems go down. But then when they went back with the naive teacher who wasn't using timeout, the behavior problems come back. Why do they come back? Because they're not using timeout. Okay, so they're not doing the program. If they're not doing the programs, the behavior problems come back. Back with the trainer who's using timeout, back with the naive teacher not using timeout, and then we did functional communication training here, just to see if it worked. And we had a number of kids, and it's a similar pattern. In the second group, we had functional communication training. Before we did the communication training, naive teacher, lots of behavior problems. With the trainer who taught them to communicate. And now with the naive teacher. What happened? How come the behavior problems didn't come back? Because we taught them to say things like, am I doing good work? When we teach them to say, am I doing good work, the naive teacher doesn't have to be trained. When a kid asks you, am I doing good work, you respond to them by talking to them. No, they know how to do that. They responded. Behavior problems stayed down. Trainer, naive teacher, trainer. Okay? What's the point? The point isn't, like in timeout, just to reduce the behavior problems. The point is, if you're going to get this to work, it has to be something that other people can respond to. Anyway, Jim, Ken, Bob, and Len, I've now learned subsequently now that you can have search and replace, so you can actually put whatever you want in and then change it later. But Anyway, Jim, Ken were rocking. Bob and Len were hand flapping. What's the motivation? Remember the 4 categories? Sensory, 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 tactile, sensory, tactile, sensory, sensory. Escape. Attention. Well, the real answer is, I don't know. We didn't do an assessment. Okay. The lesson here is don't ever assume you know why a behavior is occurring just by looking at it. In fact, rocking and hand flapping were occurring to escape. When we did an assessment, we found out that they rocked and hand flapped more when we gave them things that they didn't want to do. So our intervention was to teach them to ask for help, and it went down. Never, never assume by looking at a behavior problem why it's occurring. I'll give you another example. This is another study we conducted on a boy, one of my favorite people of all times. He would engage in psychotic speech. First time I ever met him, I walked into the classroom. He was sitting at a table with a teacher. The teacher looked up, said hi, turned to him and say hello to Dr. Durand. And he said, looks up at me and says, I stepped on my mother's grave. Blood spurt out of the tombstone. And then he went back to work. And I kind of went, hi. If you walk down the hall with him, I remember walking down the hall and holding his hand, and he looked up at me and said, parachute now? I'd say, no, not now. Or you'd be working with him and he'd go, Daddy said. What did Daddy say? He would say things out of context, unusual kinds of things. We called it psychotic speech. When I asked his teacher actually had filled out one of the earlier versions of the motivation assessment scale, and it was very odd responses. So I asked the teacher, well, why do you think he's engaging in psychotic speech? And his teacher's answer was, because he's psychotic. My response was, well, that's not one of the 4 categories that we have. So let's do an assessment. And we did an assessment on his psychotic speech and found out that he engaged in psychotic speech more often when we asked him to do something he didn't want to do. In fact, the treatment at the time for him was timeout. So if he said something unusual, he was sent to timeout. Now originally, his psychotic speech may not have been escape motivated, but sure it was learning. If you say something unusual, you don't have to work anymore, and they put you in the corner. So what we did was gave him things that were difficult, looked at his psychotic speech during baseline, then taught him to say, help me. Psychotic speech goes down, and this is his use of the phrase, help me. We went then back to baseline where we stopped responding, and there's a reason why we had to do this. He stopped saying help me and went back to engaging in psychotic speech. And then we did this condition, help me plus praise, where we would give him something difficult, he would say help me, and instead of helping him, we'd say, nice talking, that's great, good job, but we didn't help him. If we didn't help him, psychotic speech went back up and he stopped saying help me. Okay? We wanted to demonstrate that there's nothing magical about saying words. He could say potato famine, and if he got help, then that would have worked. Okay? So it was nothing magical about what he said, it had to do with what the response was. So once he got help, psychotic speech went down and he engaged in the phrase we taught him. Okay? So in our early studies, what we had to demonstrate to people was this wasn't somehow just physically replacing it. So you can't say psychotic speech at the same time you're saying help me. No, that's not the point. It's functionally incompatible, meaning if I get help, I'm not engaging in psychotic speech to escape anything. Another case comes to mind, a woman that I worked with once who had a lot of verbal skills, but also a lot of psychotic speech. And she would say things like, who, what, Susie? Never forget, who, what, Susie? And it wasn't really clear why this was happening. One day I walked in on a couple of staff, one old staff member and one new staff member, and the old staff member was saying, go ahead, say it, go ahead, say it. who, what, Susie, and they would laugh. Go ahead, say it, who, what, Susie, and they would laugh. Now, I was upset, one, because this wasn't something we were trying to encourage, two, that they were ridiculing her, but what it became clear was she might be saying who, what, Susie, because this is her only way to interact with people. She can't say, you know, how'd you like the Yankees last night, you know, or what'd you do this weekend? But she could say who, what, Susie, and people would laugh. So she would go up to staff and say who, what, Susie, and they'd say things like, oh, you know, you shouldn't say that. You know, you're not supposed to say that. Part of your program is that you don't say that. And they'd have a nice long conversation about how she wasn't supposed to say that. And then they'd move on. And then she'd come up to somebody else and say, who, what, Susie? Oh, no, you know, you're not supposed to say that. You know, that's not right. You know, what are you supposed to do? I'm not supposed to say that. Right, you're not supposed to say that. What was happening was a nice social conversation. And she was using who, what, Susie to initiate it. Okay, so was this some bizarre psychotic behavior? No. This was a form of attention getting that once we figured that out, we could replace that. What we need to do is teach her another way to initiate conversations, initiate attention from other people. Okay? If you just look at it on the surface, psychotic speech, you think out of her control, she's hallucinating, something bizarre is happening. If you look at it functionally, sometimes, even in these cases, they are things that serve a purpose. And even though she could talk, she didn't have the social skill to go up and interact with people. Once we could do that for her, she didn't engage in who, what, Susie as much anymore. This is a study that we conducted in New York and Pennsylvania. This has a kind of funny beginning. A number of years ago, I was at a conference, the ASHA conference, the international conference that they held in Philadelphia that year, American Speech and Hearing Association. And I was talking to a group of speech therapists about this kind of work, and they liked it because it involved communication training, and they had a very important role in this with us. And at one point I said, you know what would be really cool? If we had kind of, I don't know, like a little device that if you pressed it, it would actually speak. And we could have a device and you press it and it would say things like, help me, or come here. So that'd be really cool. And they were so polite. They just kind of smiled, nodded. And then the head of the association came up to me afterwards. She was very nice, and she was saying, that was a great talk, and she put her kind of arm around me, and she didn't say, you fool, but she might as well have said, you fool, because she said, there's a whole industry that makes these devices. They're called assistive augmentative communication devices, and there's lots of them out there. So once I got over my embarrassment, started to talk. She was the head of the Pennsylvania Assistive Device Center at the time, which was kind of a lending library of these things. So I said, well, why don't we work together on a project where we take individuals who are not verbal, who could use these vocal output devices, who also had behavior problems. Could we teach them to communicate with the world with these devices? So what we were looking for, by the way, was an alternative to sign language. And the reason why we're looking for an alternative to sign language is that sign language is often used very, very idiosyncratically for the kids that we work with. For example, I was in a classroom once, and I don't really know sign language that well, so I often have to ask for help. And a kid was sitting there and did this. And I said, sorry, I don't know what that means. She said, well, that means he wants to go to the bathroom. Okay. Took him to the bathroom, brought him back. At one point he went, said, oh, I think he's saying he wants to go to the bathroom. She goes, oh, no, that means he wants music. Okay. So I'm not telling you, I'm not really good at this, so maybe I'm not picking it up. And then a little bit later he went, music, bathroom, I don't know. She said, no, that means he wants to go home with his Uncle Jim this weekend. Like, what? Now, she might have been right. He might have been very subtly communicated all these things with that. But even if he did, that doesn't help him because she's the only one that knew that. Okay, it's like being in a foreign country and having an interpreter, and the interpreter leaves. you're stuck, okay? And then you get frustrated because you can't communicate with the world. So what we've been trying to do is get systems that everybody could understand, but you don't have to train someone when they say this, you do this. So that's why we went to the vocal output devices. And here's some of the data from the study. We worked with 30 kids. We had a federal U.S. Department of Education grant to actually work with kids who were in need of vocal output devices, who had severe behavior problems. We could buy the devices for them, and this was back at a time where they were really expensive. Even simple devices were really expensive. Now, we actually modified some of these, even the talking picture frames. You know, you can get a real tiny little device for a couple of dollars, really, and use it at a very simple level. But we were able to buy the devices. What we asked then, this was a fairly complicated study, because what we did was said, we're not going to do the training, meaning I'm not going to do the training. What I'm going to do is we're going to identify kids, going to identify their teachers, we're going to bring them to workshops like this. We'll do a 2-day workshop, teach them how to do an assessment, teach them how to identify the right device, and teach them to use the device, teach them how to do this intervention. And then the teachers are going to go out, take the devices, they're going to go out and use them with the kids, they're going to videotape what they've done, and we're going to assess how successful they're going to be. So basically the teachers were going to do everything. What they did then was did an assessment, and here are just some of the kids, the study. All of them had pretty severe and multiple behavior problems. They taught them to use the device, behavior problems went down. In the second phase of the study, they took Matt to the store, Allison to the mall, Mike to the movies, Ron at the store, David to the library. Would the community be able to understand them communicating with these devices? Now, this was the first time we'd ever done this, and we didn't really know what to expect. We just did it. Now, we learned a lot by that first experience. One was a lot of these devices don't work really well in the community. You need volume control. Sometimes the volume isn't high enough. We have a video of a kid at McDonald's trying to order a meal at McDonald's, a noisy McDonald's. He's pressing this thing and you can't hear it, and people are getting frustrated. So we learned a lot about that, about what to program into the machine, because what works in the classroom may not be what they need in the community. So we learned a lot about that. What we did, by the way, after this study was actually a much larger study to look at conversation skills training. How do you teach now beyond just I want, to how do you have a conversation with somebody? And I don't really have time to go into the details of it, but what we did was we had 2 groups of kids. One group, both groups, what we did was put them with a device and a typically developing peer, so a kid without special needs. One group, we taught them how to use a device to have a conversation. You press this, you say this, you press this, you say this. The other group we put together on a project. Put the device out there, but didn't teach them how to use it, and had them work together for an hour, a couple hours a week. The idea there was to give them something in common. What you saw in that video was a group of kids that have almost nothing in common trying to artificially go through in a conversation. What we wanted to do with the project was put together these 2 kids that at some later point you can say, remember when we did this? Or are you like this? Give them something in common. What we found was that we would do that. One group got skills training, one group got the project, and then we'd flip them. People got skills training, then got the project. People got the project, then got skills training. When we later tested them, the people that got the project first had much more elaborate conversations. They would switch topics more often than the kids who got training first. So what we tried to point out was that you have to do both. And it may help to do that in a context. So you can't just teach the skill, you have to give them something to talk about, you have to give them something to be interested in. What we've been talking about, actually mostly I've been talking about this, you've just been listening. What I've been talking about is what would be called accessing natural communities of reinforcement. The world out there can give you what you want if you know how to get it. I feel like one of these motivational speakers, you know. Listen and the world will come to you. It's out there. God, this does sound like motivational speaking. you can become a millionaire. What we're trying to do, again, beyond just stopping someone from engaging in a behavior problem, is to replace it, but replace it in a way that is meaningful to other people, okay, so they can respond. So the woman who was blind, who could then hand out this thing, she could communicate with the world, she could get the reinforcer that she needed from the world. Now I don't ever intend to portray to you that this is the cure for all behavior problems, this is the only thing you should do, but this is one of the best researched techniques now out there to help teaching behavior problems. Now I've already talked about a number of things. There's a whole lot of things I haven't talked about as far as looking at a person's lifestyle, making major changes in the way they live, which are all essential to this process. I haven't talked about how you plan, and I know there are probably other opportunities for you to hear about how you would do what might be called generically futures planning. So where do we want this person to be next year? Where do we want them to be in 5 years and 10 years? Because that will all guide all of what we're doing. You know, the kind of things you're teaching them to communicate will be in part guided by where you want them to be next year. You know, where do you want them to be in 5 years? What do you want them to be doing? So all of those things come into play as you're designing these interventions. And I put up there the maintenance myth. There's no such thing as a treatment that will work with behavior problems if it goes away. Okay, so whatever you do, if the treatment goes away, the behavior problems will probably come back. However, if you can build the treatment into the person, which is what we're trying to do, then they take the treatment with them. And that's where we are at this point. Let me talk to you about one more case. I talked to a number of you about adults. And I know some of you work with adults. How many of you work with adults here? Okay, a good number of people. Wow. So I have to give you equal time. What I'm going to show you is a case of an adult that I work with who was probably the most difficult person I ever had to work with. Took us the longest time to make inroads. Brings up a lot of different issues and questions. Relevant for children as well, because one of the issues that came up had to do with whether you can do one-to-one intervention when you don't have a lot of people. Okay, so not only am I committed to trying to come up with an intervention that will work outside in the real world, we need interventions that can be used in the real world when you don't have lots of one-to-one staff. So this is a case really that exemplifies how to intervene when you don't have a lot of trained people, you don't have a lot of people committed, you don't have a lot of time. Can you still do something meaningful? So that's what I want to show you. Let me show you just a brief clip of the woman who I work with first. This is, she was about 33 or 34 when I first had contact with her. She is a person who had one of those histories. You probably, if you've been in the field long enough, know that there is always a person in your county or a person in your school. You know, you mentioned about people being labeled. This person was known throughout the state because of her really lifelong history of self-injury. So she had a very long history of self-injury from the age of 2, the earliest documented records that she had been hitting herself. In fact, her grandmother was described as putting paper towel tubes on her arm so she couldn't hit herself. She blinded herself sometime in early adolescence by hitting herself so often, detached the retinas of her eyes. They thought that she was probably deaf. They couldn't really tell. She had a number of difficulties. What happened was she had this 30-plus year history of severe self-injury. In the past, they basically had tried everything that they could think of. I'll show you in a second some data from when they tried. They hired a consultant to come in to design a plan. They hired a full-time person to work with her to implement the plan. They put a lot of resources into this. These are the data from that plan. This was in the mid-'80s, I think. Baseline here is over 200. Notice this is hits per minute. So if you let her go, she'd hit herself pretty fast. Then they tried, I mentioned this before, contingent water mist. If she hit herself, again, this is mid-80s, if she hit herself, they'd squirt her in the face with water. Now you could look at this and say, well, gee, it had an effect, brought the behavior problems down here, a little bit of a problem here, and it actually, here it was ended. What happened was two things. First of all, it was a water spray. Notice this is about 25 or so sprays per minute. So she was wet all the time, and she started to become ill. The other problem was what these hits were hard hits. So she would do some of these, but then she would do some of these. And what happened was the water spray got rid of these, but not these. So what remained were the really hard hits that did damage. So at some point they stopped it as not being effective. And then they did helmet removal. They had, in the past, had put her in a motorcycle helmet with a face guard and chin guard, and she wouldn't hit the helmet. Okay, so what they thought was, well, maybe if we put her in this helmet and then take away pieces of the helmet that she wouldn't remember or she wouldn't go back to hitting herself. So what you see here is with one piece removed, another piece removed, and then as soon as they took away anything under her chin, she'd get in up underneath here and start hitting herself. So they stopped doing that. Then here is lemon juice. If she hit herself, they'd squirt lemon juice in her mouth, which is unpleasant. Behavior started coming back up. L stands for Listerine. I thought the Listerine people would be proud of that. Hits herself more, and then contingent ice. They would put an ice pack on her arm, which is unpleasant again. All different types of punishment programs they tried on her. So they stopped. This was after a number of months with a consultant, with a full-time person, number of months. And then about 2 years later, they did electric shock. Now it's easy to criticize them, but mid-80s, you've got someone who's blinded herself, who has been hitting herself forever, who has to be restrained all the time. You've tried everything. They tried all the medications that were available at the time. Argument was, and I could see it, if my child were doing that and a couple of shocks could get him to stop, I'd do it. Problem was, it wasn't a couple of shocks. So here, again, baseline, if you took her restraints off, she'd hit herself over 200 times a minute. With the shock, brought it down to about 100 times per minute. And again, these tended to be the hard hits. And then they tried it, electric shock with DRO, meaning gave her orange juice if she didn't hit herself for a brief period of time. Then it was ended here primarily because a group came in and said you can't shock people so often without their permission, so they stopped it. And then there was a hearing, and that's when I got involved, and they asked for a couple of pieces of information. One, did it work? Did the shock work? Two, if it did work, should they continue it? Three, if it didn't work, what should they do? Well, did it work? Okay, I'll be the judge now. Judge says, of course it worked. Brought it down by 50%. Then you could say, well, you shouldn't be shocking people. It's really not a good thing to do. He was not interested in that argument. What I had to argue was that when shock works, it works immediately. Meaning if you look at studies of shock, you do one or two shocks and the behavior problem pretty much goes away. This isn't going away. This is remaining. She's willing to be shocked 100 times a minute and still hit herself. What's going to happen next month and the month after when she gets used to this and her behavior problems rise again? Do you increase the level of shock? If you increase the level of shock, she'll get used to that. If she gets used to that, you have to increase it, and there's nowhere to go. There's nothing here. So we convinced the judge not to do anything, not to continue it at least for a year. And he said, we'll give you a year to try something else. So what's the first thing you do? Who said that? I heard it over here. Who said assessment? Good work. do an assessment. Why is she hitting herself? Now, when you ask the staff why is she hitting herself, they say, well, it's biological. You know, and you could get that feeling from her. If you took her hand out of restraints, her hand was trying to get to her head, desperately trying to get to her head. It felt like it was completely out of her control. Now, the one thing that you might have picked up from the restraint was when they put the restraint on, she could take her hand and do that, which meant she had some control over this. So it probably wasn't some involuntary movement that was biologically based. She could control it. So we did an assessment. We didn't do a functional analysis, meaning we didn't let her hit herself. We did the motivation assessment scale. And what you find is that when you do the motivation assessment scale, you don't get clear results because she hits herself all the time. So what we did then was broke it down into hard hits and light hits. So we did an assessment on the hard hits and an assessment on the light hits. The light hits came up as sensory. The hard hits came up as escape. And escape from basically anything. If you made her stand up, boom. If you made her sit down, boom. Anything would set off the hard hits. So what we did then was decided, okay, let's do something. We have a year, let's do something. Let's try to communicate for her to escape. So what you're going to see now is some of the first sessions I worked with her to try to teach the staff what to do. Now picture this. Because of all the legal issues involved, there are about 18 people watching and videotaping. No pressure. Oh, the other part of the problem was that they said that they were willing to do this, but that they were afraid that she would hurt herself if she were going to have to use her hands to communicate. And they said, well, you can't let her hurt herself. So we decided we were going to intervene while she was still in the restraints. She's in her chair, she's in restraints. I asked them for something, and they had a tongue depressor because they were in the hospital. Tongue depressor, I put it in her hand, tapped her hand, she gave it back to me. That was the first step. Would she be able to give me something to communicate? You can imagine how much in awe all the staff were at this amazing intervention. It's like, what are we doing? Okay. Let me just show you what the data look like. Here again is kind of baseline without restraints, hits herself. This is during our training. What you see here, I'm not going to go into all the details, but basically different levels of training. So both hands in restraint, does she hand this to us? One hand out of the mechanical restraint, but we're holding her wrist. Then two hands out of restraints, both holding her wrist. And then both hands out of restraint, holding one wrist but not the other, letting it go. Does great when we do the training. So we were able to kind of go through this. Now, I mentioned the time factor. They gave her, we asked how much time could you do this? This is not all me doing this. How much time could you commit to working with her? And they said 20 minutes a day, 2 days a week. So, okay, 20 minutes a day, 2 days a week, and ended up being 20 minutes a day, 1 day a week with people forgetting sicknesses. And I mention this because it's not like we had to work with her 24 hours a day with one-on-one, okay? That's all I had, so could we still do this? So this is 20 minutes a day, 1 day a week, basically, which was all fine, but actually outside of training, she was still hitting herself. So she was learning how to give this to us. She wasn't hitting herself. We eventually got both of her hands out of restraint. We weren't holding that. She would give us that tongue depressor thing, then we would put her back in restraint. That was all great, but whenever we took her hands out of restraint outside of training, she'd still hit herself. And then here, what happened was we changed it to involve iconic symbols. So instead of having the tongue depressor, we had a piece of leather that meant I want my restraint back on. We had a toy chair that meant I want to sit in my chair. So she could feel the difference and give us that. Once we did that, she started reaching in and handing it to us on her own, so without prompting. Once she started doing that, she started doing it outside of training, and she stopped hitting herself as much. So this is about a little bit more than a year after we started working with her. This is a year after that. This is in 19, 92? Yeah, so we'd take her out of restraint, and if she gave us a piece of leather, that meant I want my restraint back on. And that was usually her safe place, and that was fine. At this point, we started taking away the leather because she was out of restraints pretty much all the time now, so we didn't have that as an option anymore. But she could ask to sit in her chair, and eventually that meant I want to be left alone. So chair meant if I'm working, push me away. If I'm in my room, I just want to be left alone. She has had good times and bad times, sometimes with more hits, none with any injury to herself. Periodically, they have to re-teach her how to communicate with them. What they wanted to try to do was get her to use a toy toilet. That meant I need to go to the bathroom because she was schedule trained, but she wouldn't spontaneously communicate that when she needed to go. They never were able to do that, it just never worked. So they were able to teach her to give the chair, which meant I want a break. They were able to give her a toy cup, which meant I want something to drink, and she would reach in and give them a toy cup. She had a little apron that she would reach in to do that. She went from almost no time being worked with to being in pre-vocational skills training with everybody else there. And again, if she was working and she's had enough, she would reach in, give the chair, and they would push her back, and she'd be fine. So she's gone now 13 years without, almost 13 years, without restraints, without the medication. Took us a good 18 months to get her there. What's the point? The point is you can do this without having one-to-one, without having the most highly trained people in the world, but you need to understand why it's happening. You need to teach some alternatives. You need to be patient. In the case of the woman pink, you need to have a lot of faith that this can work, and we'll make minor changes until we see some improvements. So even if you're in your 30s, even if you've had a many decade-long history, it's still possible to make some significant changes, and that's what we're doing.